Welcome, everybody, to the Mark Vine Show. Thanks for joining us. And this is your one-stop shop for the truth, for inspiration, for self-help, for motivation, and really just a general reason to go on living every single day. This is the place for it. Visit us on our website and our Facebook site, rather, and that's the Mark Vines Show Facebook site. So just give us a follow, give us a like, and go ahead and spread the message and spread this podcast to all of your friends, your foes, and most importantly, the Democrats that are out there, because it will help them realize the wrongs of their ways. And so with that, guys, I have a special guest here today, and that's Clint Morano. I've worked with Clint Morano for I've worked with Clint for a few years, but the fact is, Clint, I've known you for over 20 years. We actually met at the FBI Academy many years ago. And welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Mark. I appreciate it.
All right. And so the fact is that we are getting close to the election. We are within a couple of months, actually, or close to a couple of months towards the election. And this is a really interesting time. And Clint, I know you have a big desire or a big interest in history. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on the State of the Union today. Clint, what do you think?
Well, Mark, it's interesting because if you listen to the media, you hear them talk about how polarized and how troubled these times are in our political scene and in our social, our society is in general, all these issues that we're facing. But trust me, I consider myself an amateur historian. I do a lot of history reading. I taught a history class on leadership for the FBI for quite a few years. So I am read up on the subject, and I was a history major in college, but I do not have a PhD in history. So that being said, if you take a look at American history, this is not uncommon for us. This country has gone through multiple eras of strife that, if people at any given time would have said, this is the most polarized or dysfunctional that the country has ever been politically. That being said, what always amazes me, and this is the old cliche, is that history always repeats itself. That's why you're supposed to study history to try to avoid those mistakes. Well, here's the lesson for today. Guess what? We're making the same mistakes that we've made, multiple times in our history. I've been looking closely recently at the events leading up to the American Civil War, and actually, I've been rereading books on Reconstruction, which followed right after the Civil War. And if you had interviewed Abraham Lincoln in 1863 or 1864 and asked him how his day was, I bet he would trade that day for any single day any president, maybe except for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had since then. When you look at the amount of death and destruction and what was at stake in trying to persevere the Union, and that's what the war really for the North was about. It was trying to preserve this union of a republic, of a democracy that had never been seen in the history of the world. And even at that time, when Europe was dominated by kings and queens and oligarchs and this and that, we had a representative democracy, a republic. And the fight was to try and bind that union together so that this great hope that the founding fathers had come up with would not just vanish. Because if we had allowed the South to walk away from it, that grand experiment would have failed. So how does that transposed to today. Well, look at what's going on in America today, and you could kind of draw parallels. And I don't really want to pick on the Democratic Party too much, but it's almost ironic that the driving force of chaos and a rebellion within the United States today is the Democratic Party, just as it was in 1860 and in 1861 when they drove the southern states into secession from the Union. Now, instead of actual states taking up arms to try and dismantle what was the election of 1860 and Abraham Lincoln, right? Because they didn't like the results of that election. And so they decided we weren't going to be part of this team anymore. You've had, for day one of this presidency, a concerted effort to dismantle what was the popular vote, well, the vote of the United States, of the Electoral College.
Yeah.
And you look at what's happening right at this moment. You have these gangs and violence in the street backed by the left, causing this, what is basically rebellion. You have them taking over cities. You have them confronting the police. You have them confronting federal troops and federal, law enforcement. Granted, these aren't this isn't the Democratic Party per se saying, pick up guns and let's go fight, to cause a revolution. But yet, this is the philosophy of these individuals. This is what they align to, right? These are left people. These are people that would vote Democrat. These are people who are going to vote for the Democratic nominee, most likely, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I don't actually. When you look at these protests, Clint, is there anybody there that's a Trump supporter? I mean, anybody really?
No,
you're right.
No, and it is funny because I was watching the news the other day, which I try to avoid nowadays because it's just so disturbing. But I watched Joe Biden give a speech about how Donald Trump was the one fanning and fueling the flames of all this violence in America. And I looked, I go, really? I don't see anybody running around in Trump masks and Trump flags and Trump hats, busting into, businesses, looting them, burning them. I don't see Trump supporters yelling at people as they're trying to have dinner. I don't see Trump supporters chasing people down in the street, screaming at them. Or I don't see Trump supporters lining across highways, blocking commerce and traffic. I don't see any of this. These are people who are leftists, radical leftists who are trying to cause this change in our government because they don't like the results of an election. And that's just the same as it was, in the 1860s, which unfortunately cost us, over, all in total, 1 million casualties, 600,000+ of those killed in action. That's of course counting North and South. It's an interesting tally, right? Because in any war that we ever fight, the body count is just U.S. troops. Well, in the Civil War, everybody was an American, so the total body count was nowadays they're saying it's almost 700,000 people died in the 4 years of the Civil War. So if you want to talk about reparations, talk about that. That was that bill, that sin of slavery was paid for in the blood of literally millions. So I think that bill and that debt was paid for by anybody that picked up that, that blue uniform and, carried the stars and stripes into every battle from the 1861 through 1865.
And Clint, I really appreciate the insight on that, because I'm sort of a part-time historian myself, and I really had not made the connection quite the way that you just did. And that is that really the same people, if you think about it, if you are a student of history, it's the same group of people, to be honest with you. Because what's interesting is, and in the last podcast, I was talking about Whitmer up in Michigan, and how she claimed that there were all these neo-Nazis and white supremacists and Klan members that were up just, standing outside the Capitol up there, and that these were all Trump supporters. And to this day, I have not seen any evidence that there were any Nazi flags or Klansmen, there. She said that, but it was never proven. But what's interesting about that is, if you know your history, folks, the Ku Klux Klan was actually started by Confederates, and in fact started by the Democrats. That's where it comes from. That is not a Republican thing. The Republicans back in the 1860s were fighting against that. And it's the same group of people. They are trying to turn history around, and they, to a great degree, are succeeding at that, because most Americans actually don't understand American history. The Republican Party is for freedom. It is for individual rights. It is for a smaller government, and we fought against those things during the Civil War. And it really is just a lot of mayhem that's going on right now. And Clint, and I'll ask you to address this as well, because we heard from Hillary Clinton just a week or two ago, where her advice to Joe Biden is, do not accept defeat. Do not accept the results of the election. And that's what she did. That's what this whole Russia investigation was about. But she's telling Joe Biden, hey, it worked so well for me. Joe, maybe you ought to do the same thing. And what the Democrats are doing is they are signaling that they are not going to win the election. The confidence is not there, Clint. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you watch the polls, right, it's Trump is being destroyed right now, as far as the election predictions go, but he also was destroyed by Hillary Clinton, and look how that turned out.
I was going to say, we've heard this before.
But I wouldn't sit back on my laurels and think it's a shoo-in, because you have so much working against you that it. If he does win again, it'll almost be a miracle. It surely will be, because you have at one time, you would talk about loyal opposition, when facing, a bad, do you think Republicans, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a Democrat, and he served 3 terms, was elected for the 4th during World War II, prior to World War II and into World War II. Did the Republicans at that time try to just derail his executive branch, his leadership at the time? No. It was something called the loyal opposition, right? But they all worked together because they knew they were confronting this enemy that was in our face, Hitler and the Nazi totalitarian state, and Japan, the empire of Japan. So everybody joined together, and we fought that war unified. What has happened, though, is that, and James Madison said this, when he was writing the Constitution, he's like, why do republics fail? And he looked at all the republics and democracies that had occurred in history, and they all failed for one reason, because the elected individuals put themselves and their benefit in front of that of the nation. And I think that is where this root of real political, confrontation that we have today is that our elected politicians, are putting themselves in front of the people of this country and the nation. And they don't care about what happens as long as they continue to get elected and they continue to stay in power. So they'll do anything they can to do that. And if that means, we are pawns for the Russians and the Chinese right now. The Russians and the Chinese are playing us against each other, and we are stupid enough to allow them to do it. They are feeding this turmoil, and, instead of us saying, no, we are not going to let these, this enemy come at us, they take that ball and they run with it just because they'd rather destroy that person who's in the White House or who has control of the Senate, or, they'd rather destroy their political opposition than destroy an enemy who truly wants to ruin our country.
And I think our enemies, and Clint, and that's a very good point, because it was Abraham Lincoln that said, again in the 1860s, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And what he meant by that was that this republic, folks, is not, we are not going to be defeated by an enemy, that we are the superpower on the planet. Our enemies are not going to physically defeat us. The way they will defeat us is from within. And that's exactly what they're doing. And when people talk about Russian interference and maybe even Chinese interference, there are attacks on this country, but it's not the way that people think. I think that Joe Blow out on the street thinks that Russians are going in and tampering with individual voting stations, in these areas where we're going to vote. And that's what they're worried about in November. But what they don't understand is that is not what the Russians are doing. Barack Obama actually said in 2016 that there's a famous clip of him in Florida actually talking about how that was impossible to do. And I agree with him. They're not doing it that way. What they're doing is putting out false information and then pitting one American against another. And they are encouraging us to tear each other apart. That's how they're going to defeat us. And ironically, that is exactly what Abraham Lincoln predicted a long time ago would be done. And people need to wake up to the fact that this is almost like asymmetrical warfare. This is not direct combat. It is combat coming from a different angle. And people, I see it, you see it, Clint, but I don't think that our listeners necessarily see that.
Yeah, no, that quote was that was a paraphrase from a biblical passage that he used during one of the Lincoln Douglas debates when he was running for the Senate against Stephen Douglas. But he saw too that the North, which was based on free labor, right? And the South, which was its economy was based on slave labor, the two could not coexist for an extended period of time. They just could not. So he saw that, he foresaw that. But you're right. And another thing that people don't realize too is when you look at China, you're talking about, I mentioned this because you talk about asymmetric warfare. Mm-hmm. When you look at China, right, and you say, we opened up the doors to China, where we have all this commercial trade with China, it benefits them just as much as us to have this trade, with them build products, we buy them, all this. Well, all you have to do is go back and look at a economic system that was around the time of the Revolutionary War called mercantilism. Are you familiar with that from your history books?
Yes, I am. Mm-hmm.
So mercantilism was an economy that was designed to support the state, right? And that it could be used as a weapon against your enemies, so that through mercantilism and controlled trade, you make your enemies become dependent on you economically, and therefore you can control their politics because you have their economic power in your hands. And it worked very well in that 18th century time because you had, these totalitarian states like France and England where they had kings and queens, and that worked very well with that type of political leadership that you would have such a strong centralized economic system. And, and mercantilism worked here in the United States by, Great Britain took natural resources. Remember the triangular trade with rum from the West and the West Indies to the United States, and then raw materials to Great Britain, and then they made all the machined materials out of that, and it sold that back to the colonies. But in the process, they would undercut. So say France makes widget A at this amount of money, the English government was going to say, all right, we will make it significantly less than the French because we are controlling this trade of raw resources and everything, and we can undermine their ability to produce it so they become dependent on us. And you use that as a weapon until it's no longer a weapon, and then you actually go to war with somebody. That is mercantilism. And when you look at China, what are they doing? What is their economic? They're not capitalists, that's for sure, right? They're more like mercantilists. They're communists using a capitalist style economy to become a weapon against us, so that we are so tied to them that we can't break free, or we dare not try to fight them. And Trump, to his credit, what did he come in and say right from the get-go? This trade imbalance is no good. We need to stop this. We need to make it more equal, And the Chinese, of course, are like, no, because we're not ready to go to war yet. We want to keep pushing this, this other form, this asymmetric form of warfare, until we actually do have the military strength to be able to stand up to the United States if we have to.
Yeah, and they're working on that, aren't they?
Oh, yes, they are. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I tell you what, Clint, and if the folks that are listening out there, there's a fantastic book out there called The 100-Year Marathon, which lays out China's plan for the long term, the 100-Year Marathon. So I'd recommend that. And the problem is that the Chinese have the long view of history. They're very patient in what they're doing, but Americans just don't have that sense of history, and we are a society of instant gratification. And for us, history started. It's almost like if it didn't happen in your lifetime, it didn't happen.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. History, to most people, they confuse memories with history, and the media doesn't help by it because the media peddles, and that's what they deal in. They deal in memories. They don't deal in historical facts, right? So that's why you have so many people walking around confused about what our actual history is, because I don't know what's happened in elementary schools anymore, or high schools. I don't know what they're getting taught. My kids have long been out of high school, but if I find it somewhat worrisome that people could be so ignorant of what our actual history is, and then when you quiz them on something, it's what they heard from the news. Mm-hmm. That is not history.
Yeah, and the problem is that people feel like we've not moved on from our history. There's nothing that we can do. If we could go back in time, are there things that we would want to change in our history? Absolutely, but that's not reality. There's not one thing in your life, Clint, or my life that I can look back on, or you can look back on and say, I really wish I hadn't done that. There's nothing you can do about it. What is done is done. And what happened in this country happened in this country. And we had a war to settle that. We had growing pains after that, which went on up into the 1960s. But to say that we live in the same environment now in 2020 that we were in 1965 or 1970 is just ridiculous. And at some point, we need to move forward as a nation and not continue to live in the past. And the fact is, I'm 54 years old, Clint, and I know you're around the same age as I am. And I, up until a couple of months ago, I did not walk around, and I'm sure you didn't walk around thinking, oh my God, we're at each other's throats, and look at the racial injustice. And I've been in law enforcement most of my adult life, and I've never been in, whether it was the FBI, the police department, or as a corrections officer, I don't remember sitting around with people going, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go beat up and torture some black people tonight. That's never happened in my career. And I'm not aware of that ever happening anywhere in law enforcement. But all of a sudden, we've got to burn cities down because of racial injustice. Like, where did this come from? But I do know this. I know it's not healthy. And I also know that all of this, and we're going to have to wrap up here, Clint, real quick, and we'll continue this on in our next session. Those of you that are big supporters of Black Lives Matter, what you're doing is you're hiding behind a phrase, Black Lives Matter, which, of course, everybody believes that. Everybody believes Black Lives Matter. But the problem is they've taken this Marxist violent movement and put it behind a name that they know that nobody can dispute because it just makes sense. But the fact is, this is a very, very violent movement, and the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, all these groups have gotten behind it. And I'll tell you, it's starting to backfire. The support for BLM is woefully dropping down quite a bit. And it's going to be interesting because the football season starts next week, and it's going to be interesting to see what those ratings are like.
Yeah.
So, Clint,
absolutely.
Last word, and then we'll move on and continue on in the next session.
Well, Mark, I look forward to hooking back up with you. I think there's a lot more we can talk about. There's a lot of other things I would like to revisit some more on the history of the Democratic Party from its founding to today, because we could really delve into that some more, and because I probably shouldn't say this, right? Because I'll come off as like Patton did in the movie. But, the Nazi Party is outlawed in Germany, right? You can't have the Nazi Party. If you look at the history of the Democratic Party and what it's done from its foundation to, through the Civil War and to Reconstruction and to Jim Crow, and you would say, how could we allow such a party to exist? So,
That's right. Absolutely.
We could talk about that next time.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed it, Clint, and we will talk to you soon. And everybody, thanks again for joining the Mark Vine Show. Check out the Facebook site. Give us a like, give us a follow, give me comments. And if you're a liberal and you disagree with me and you want to come on here and talk about it, then you come in here and I will give you a great counseling session. And with that, thanks again, Clint Morano, and we will see you soon. Thank you.